All right, ladies. I hope you're enjoying your snow day. Hope you slept in and are feeling refreshed. I am at home and just downloaded this new program, which is pretty easy to record myself. So I'm giving it a whirl, and I'm going to go quickly through the slides that we've already covered in class and then spend a little bit more time on the slides that we didn't cover. So just to kind of refresh your memory, we are in Italy. We are in the 14th century, and we're looking right now at all of these city-states that I talked about. So we're going to look at art in Florence, in Sienna, in Venice, so all different places in Italy. Okay, so zipping through. Okay, we talked about this idea of humanism, focused on the self. Okay, how education is becoming more valuable. And then all of these tragic events happening in the 14th century, okay? And we talked about the effects this has on the art. We saw a lot of pain and suffering, particularly in German Gothic sculpture, okay? So you'll see a little bit of that in Italian art as well, okay? So you just want to pay attention to these events and definitely know about the Black Death and just how devastating it was in this time period, okay? Okay, zipping through. So we're seeing the influence of Byzantine art, obviously with the stiff figures, the rigid stance, the elongated bodies, okay? But then we also pointed out some characteristics from this particular piece that we could associate with Italian Gothic, because remember, this art, we're still in the Gothic period, okay, but we're in Italy, so this is Italian Gothic. So what features did we discuss that are associated with the Gothic period? How could you distinguish this from a Byzantine or an early medieval manuscript if you saw it on a test? Okay, and just to remind you again, anytime you're seeing these bolded, underlined statements in my PowerPoint, you definitely want to pay a little extra attention to that. Okay, moving along. We talked about Nicola Pisano. His son Giovanni Pisano talked about the differences between their two artworks. So think about what we discussed, the influence of classical art here, the influence of Rome. Okay, in one of them, do you remember which one that was? Hopefully you do. Okay, and then I showed you this Roman sarcophagus as a little comparison back to the 2nd century there. Okay, and then just this idea of, we talked about what sort of artistic innovations are happening during the Renaissance. The Renaissance is known as this period of enlightenment, and we talked about this idea of perspective and of modeling, okay? And you want to be familiar with that term, modeling, okay? I always emphasize to you guys that when you're writing essays, you want to use as much art history terminology as you can, and modeling is one of those words. And modeling just means the artist has used light and shadow to create depth, to make the illusion of these forms as three-dimensional. Okay, sorry for the pause. I'm trying to figure out how to get this full screen and get it to fit, but it's not happening. So we'll just keep going. So anyway, I was talking about three-dimensionality, the introduction of modeling using light and dark, okay? And do you remember the term that we talked about in class, that term that is referring to contrast, the contrast between light and dark? And you're going to see it again, okay? So try to remember, and we will get to it in a minute if you don't remember. So we talked about this this piece, Madonna Enthroned with Angels and Prophets by Cimabue, okay, who was the teacher of whom? Hopefully you remember. We'll get to him in a moment. Um, and we're obviously seeing a lot of Byzantine influence here, obviously with all of the gold, okay, and typical religious subject matter, okay. Still, still kind of flat, but we're seeing attempts at modeling, attempts at three-dimensionality in the faces of the angels, in the faces of the Virgin, okay, and the fact that they're overlapping. On the bottom portion of the piece, we see the prophets, okay, with their scrolls, and we see attempts at linear perspective there as well. Okay, moving along. Oops. Okay. Giotto, hopefully you remembered his name. He's very important. You'll definitely see at least one of his pieces on the AP exam, so you need to be familiar with him. And remember how I said this is the time where things get a little trickier because you're going to have to know artists' names and you're going to have to recognize their style and recognize their work. Okay, and Giotto is one of them. Okay, so Giotto, we talked about his story, how he was a shepherd. He did this beautiful painting on a rock, supposedly, and Cimabue sees him and, invites him to come to the city of Florence and, teaches him. Okay, so obviously we see some influence from Cimabue, but Giotto is really the one who takes perspective to a new level and really makes forms three-dimensional. They are no longer stiff. They are no longer emotionless, okay? They act like real people, all right? So Giotto and Duccio, who we're going to look at in a minute, led the rejection of the Byzantine tradition and rediscovered the human form, human emotions, and the natural world. Okay, and we watched a little bit of the Sister Wendy Giotto video. Hopefully you guys liked it. It is 30 minutes long, so we won't be able to finish it in class, but I do encourage you to watch it on your own. As I said numerous times, all of these buildings and paintings and altarpieces, you're really not getting a sense of their scale just by looking at a little picture in your textbook. So please take the time to watch at least a few of these videos. Okay, and here we see Madonna enthroned again by Giotto. It looks like the caption is cut off, so I'm going to minimize again. Sorry for the confusion. Okay, so if we compare this to Cimabue, okay, let's look at them side by side. Okay, what differences do you see? Okay, hopefully you remembered our discussion in class, the shading around the chin. The Virgin Mary's body is visible underneath her robes. Okay, we're seeing this light and dark interplay appear. Okay, we are seeing the angels still overlapping, but some of the angels that are in the background have darker values. Okay, so we're seeing Giotto paying attention to a light source. Okay, part of the figures are illuminated, other parts of the figures are in shade. Okay, so you want to take note of that. Also, this attempt at perspective. Again, the Virgin Mary is inside, okay, of this structure. It has depth. We can tell that it's receding in space. So this is new. This is important. This is the beginning of Renaissance art. Okay, we talked about the Arena Chapel, very important. Know the purpose of this chapel. Do you remember the purpose? Was it public? Was it private? Who was it made for? Okay, think about that. All right, what medium was used to paint these walls? Okay, So think about all of that and remember what we discussed in class. Okay, zipping along. So this is one of the scenes from the Arena Chapel, okay? And just a perfect example of Giotto's mastery of composition. No longer are we seeing the stiff frontal figures that are facing toward us with no emotion. All of these figures have, expressions, clear expressions on their faces. All right, we see the Virgin Mary cradling Jesus, very sorrowful. We see all of the faces of the angels, and remember in the Sister Wendy video when she zoomed in on all of their faces and how anguished they were. And then just this, diagonal line he's created with this rocky outcropping, leading our eye to the focal point, which again is not smack dab in the center. He's placing it off to the side. He's reduced the size of this tree in the background, creating this illusion of depth. Objects that are farther away from us should be smaller. Okay, Giotto understands this. Okay, not to mention the modeling again. We get a sense of space, we see real bodies, we see overlapping. The figures are weighty and are planted on the ground. No longer are we seeing the floating figures that we saw in Byzantine art. Okay, Sienna and Florence. We already talked about them a little bit. They're notable for their strong contributions to art. Okay, so you want to associate Giotto with Florence and Duccio with Sienna. Okay, so this is Virgin and Child enthroned again by Duccio. Okay, here they are surrounded by saints. And this is a large scale altarpiece, okay, that would have been placed inside of a chapel or a cathedral. And we talked about how, we see all of these churches being erected during this time for pilgrimages, and because of that, we're seeing a large demand for art. Okay. One thing I forgot to mention about the Arena Chapel, let's go back for just a moment. It's extremely important, and this really was the piece that made Giotto famous, in a sense. Before him, artists were just simple craftsmen, and this piece really made everyone know his name, and he became, quite in demand from wealthy Italians. All right, so let's go back to the Maesta altarpiece. So you want to pay attention to this term, predella, or a raised shelf at the base of the altarpiece. So these altarpieces were often very, very large. Some of them were diptychs and triptychs. Hopefully you know those words by now. And this one, and most of the altarpieces that we'll look at in this chapter, is painted with tempera on wood. Tempera being a paint made from egg whites and pigment. Very quickly, dries very quickly, but you are able to get these brilliant, brilliant hues with tempera. Okay, so those bright orange and red cloaks, stand out, as well as the royal blue. Okay, very vivid colors. Okay, here it is again, and again we see soft modeling. Okay, look at her, her knee is slightly illuminated. He's again paying attention to the light source. There's clearly light and shade going on here. Okay, and then this I just threw in here. This isn't in your book, but I just thought it was pretty cool and gives you a sense of what it would look like. Now, this is not giving you a sense of scale. I believe it's like 13 feet high or something like that, but this is the back of the Maesta altarpiece, and you can see all of the little panels that are filled in with these individual paintings. Another thing to note that is a lot of these pieces were you know,